During this video, what I'll do is go through and explain how to use the template for a lesson plan found in your syllabus. First and foremost, as I placed in D2L, you would simply copy and paste the template into a new Word document so that you're able to work with the document without having to go back and later pull it from the syllabus and risk the chances of deleting any information that you placed in. The purpose of this class is not so much the focus of the lesson plan, but your ability to synthesize your understanding between the use of literary practices, i.e. reading, writing, to further develop your students' literacy abilities, reading comprehension, through it while you are in the midst of teaching biology content. And so the key is to develop activities that will allow you to make them look as one. Our discussion questions will allow you to go through and do some research to gain a further understanding, and within those discussion questions you will be expected to respond to your classmates to also further your understanding. But let's go to the lesson plan. It begins with Roman number 1, planning. Your central focus is what you will look at first. It is the big idea. What, first of all, is the subject that you decided to select? For example, for secondary biology, if you want to look at genetics. So your central focus question or statement should be an overarching idea about genetics. What is it that you want your students to learn through your lesson? From there, you would need to list the state or national standards. I have created links for those in D2L. Once you select them, it will take you directly to the internet. The best thing about those PDFs is you're able to copy, so just copy and paste them. Be sure that when you select a standard, you also include the substandard, which are signified by the lowercase letters. You only need one standard and one substandard. Per lesson plan, you'll only be developing 2 lesson plans. Let's move into context for learning. In this area, it begins to ask you questions about the things that you would do for students that have IEPs and 504s. And those are students that fall under the umbrella of special education. This is not the focus of this class. And so I would suggest that you go in and the examples that they have given, just delete those and place NA in all caps in the far left column, and then move forward. Learning targets are found in section 1.4. These are the objectives that you want your students to meet based on the standard you have selected and the central focus. The activities that you develop will aid your students in meeting those objectives, and we'll also go down a little further into the lesson plan and talk about assessments. And those assessments should be aligned with your learning objectives as well. Where it says teacher notes, as you move further into the education curriculum and your classes begin to intensify, you will be required to develop units, and that's 3 or more lesson plans. Again, for the sake of this class, you only develop 2 lesson plans, and so that is what's going to be comprised as your unit. And so when it asks you to clarify where this lesson falls in the unit, for the first one you would simply state that this is the first lesson of the unit, where we intend to study, whatever it is you're studying, and I will go back in there and add my central focus in the form of a statement. Let's move on to the next part. Well, not in the next part yet, I'm sorry. This is the last part of the part 1, and we're looking at 1.5, academic language. This is one of the areas where people struggle the most, and because this class is not one of your higher level classes, although it says 4100, recall that it's going to be used in place of 2201. And so you've not had a lot of practice with this format of lesson plan, and so I'm going to go into detail here. Key vocabulary, quite simple. Once you have selected your central focus, your standards, learning targets, you know what you want to teach, and so obviously there are particular vocabulary that go with it, and you would simply list those there. Where it says functions, we're looking at language functions. I've also placed a PDF of a language function toolkit, where you can go to decide which language function you want to use. A language function is simply an action verb that you would use throughout the duration of your lesson with the purpose of helping your students to understand the content. Again, the goal at the end of the day is to make sure that your lesson is based on the standard, and also to get your students to the point where they are meeting those learning objectives that are based on your standards and your content subject or topic. It says here, clarify the purpose. The purpose the language function is intended to achieve within each subject area. Functions often consist of the verbs found in the standards and learning goals statement. How will your students demonstrate their understanding? So with that information, in choosing the standard, also too, I want you to focus on the Georgia Standards of Excellence. Those are the standards that the state of Georgia are moving to. The Georgia Performance Standards have not been done away with, but those standards will give you those action verbs, meaning language functions. And so from there, in developing your learning objectives, what you can do is make sure that each of your learning objectives begins with that particular language function. And so state those there. Again, how will your students demonstrate their understanding? And so you will say, students will demonstrate their understanding of the language function describe or explain, whichever one you choose. Key hint, describe is the easiest one, and so is explain. You would simply state how your students will demonstrate their understanding of the content in using the language function. And so not that they will say the language function, but talk about how the students will perform the language function. And so the next column asks you to describe the structures or ways of organizing language to serve a particular function within each subject area. What kinds of structures will you implement so that your students might demonstrate their depth of understanding? Here is where you can list different practices that you will implement in order to make sure that the students understand how to act out the language function. Again, I will continue to go back to describe, because describe is the easiest. And so the simplest thing to do is to list the activities. Students will describe, blah, 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 and then from there, you need to state in detail how doing so will prove or show what they've learned or how deep they have learned the content material. Again, this is hypothetical, so be as elaborate and creative as possible, because you're not actually in the place of teaching. 1.6 asks you to list your instructional materials, equipment, and technology. That's easy. What is it that you plan on using in these lessons and activities? Just list that all there. As we go into instruction, it says prior knowledge connection. So what should your students already know to help them understand the information that you are trying to teach them now? Or what have they possibly experienced in their real lives that will contribute to their understanding of your current content? Motivation. And so here, what you want to discuss is how this lesson will be meaningful to your students. You will elaborate here on a real world connection. So I'll go back to genetics. That's always my favorite example. And so you could state, if genetics was your topic, let's say you're looking at dominant alleles or heterotypes or genotypes, this will help. This lesson may help your students to understand why they have blue eyes like this parent and not green eyes of the other parent, just to help them kind of live the content. Let's go ahead and move down into learning and teaching activities. What the teacher does. Now, don't be confused where it says script, detail, step by step. They do want to know step by step what it is you intend to do as a teacher, but we don't need to know what you're going to say. I've had an example of a student that literally scripted out what she will say. So her lesson plan said, "Good morning, class." We don't need to know that, but what we do need to know is exactly what it is you are going to do. And there is a detailed description here of what is required from the lesson plan. And so I'll give you an example. The student will model for students how to complete the genetic modification lab or something like that. And so in the next column it says student does. So you will need to describe exactly what the student is going to do that correlates directly with what you just stated that the teacher had performed. And differentiation is also another struggling practice, and also ask you to notate accommodations. There's a major difference between differentiation and accommodation. Differentiation is simply developing activity to meet a particular learning target and then going back and making sure to develop at least one more level of understanding for that lesson, activity, or assessment. So what does that mean? So if I have a student that's up here, you have your A student, your student that can work independently, your student that does not struggle. I have a particular lesson designed for them. Well, I could take that same lesson and figure out a way to make it successful for students that do have some kinds of struggles. I always recommend that you develop at least 3, because in a true classroom, you're going to have at least 3 different levels of academic ability that you need to meet. As we move over into assessment, and again, when we talk about differentiation, you're going to talk about how you're going to differentiate these activities that you just talked about when you reference what the teacher does and what the student does. These are just activities. For science, I say there's no such thing as I can't think of an activity. Why? Because we are science. So there's labs that you can complete. And so some of you may be in this class and you may not be biology specifically, but still use whatever content of science that you prefer. But everybody in this class should be biology major of some sort, either BS or BSED, mostly BSED. And so on the last section, we're on the home stretch, which is section 3. You look at assessments. Formative assessment are assessments that you will conduct throughout your lesson. Again, this is hypothetical. So what would you do to make sure that your students are meeting your learning objectives? List those various formative assessments there. This is just one lesson plan, so you can simply put 1 or 2, and then you would state how you would differentiate. And so again, think back to those 3 levels of learners that you would typically have in a classroom. How would you take that same assessment and make it not necessarily easy for students that struggle, but make it so that they have a greater opportunity at success, meet them where they are? You would do the same thing for the summative assessment, but the summative assessment is an assessment that looks like the sum of what they've learned. And so basically this would be an assessment that you would give at the end of a lesson plan or at the end of a unit. And you would, again, differentiate 3 levels of the summative assessment. An example for that could be your high order students may not have any multiple choice at all. They have to meet all the learning objectives based on the questions that you've given. They may be all essay questions. They may have to label, where you may have a lower level test where students have labeling a few, fill in the blanks, and then they may have multiple choice. You may have your last test, your lower level test, where the students really struggle, and you would make the entire test multiple choice and maybe 1 labeling question. The reason why you would do that is, 1, you've given them options to choose from, whereas the other students have to access and use higher order thinking skills. For your closure, this needs to be a culminating activity, some kind of activity that students can participate in to demonstrate that they've met the learning objectives for this particular lesson. One popular one is Think, Pair, Share. Google is your friend, so always go into Google and just you can look up good closing activities for science classrooms and things like that. One that I used to use a lot was called a quick write, and so you give students maybe 2 or 3 minutes and they have to write down every single thing that they remembered from the lesson that day. Or you could do a quick draw where students have to draw pictures, a picture or multiple pictures, to explain or demonstrate what they've learned. Or you can combine it and do a quick draw, quick write, or you can have students to choose if they want to do a quick draw or quick write. That right there was simple differentiation. It doesn't ask you to differentiate for a closure, but you can do so. And then lastly, you would just list the homework that you would provide. And everything that I've given you, whether I elaborated or gave an example, has further instructions listed here on the lesson plan. And so if you have any questions, definitely email me so that we can iron it out. But hopefully this video helps a lot. One thing I forgot to elaborate on was accommodation when I was talking about differentiation for your activities as well as for your assessments. Accommodation is making special privileges or arrangements for students. And this typically takes place when you have students that have IEPs and 504s. Again, those students that fall under students having disabilities. And an example of an accommodation is making sure that a student is allowed to sit in the front of the classroom, or allowing a student to have extended time. Extended time is popular. Sometimes teachers use peer mentors where a particular student always has another student to assist them. Let's say if you have note taking in your class, well, an accommodation for one of those students that have an IEP or 504 may simply be that you provide them with printed notes. And what that does is allow them to stay on task and abreast with what's going on in the class. But that's the end of our crash course on lesson plan development.